Well, this day has come. We are discussing episode 9 of Masters of the Air, the final episode. And it went fast and it was very um, fulfilling in so many ways. I know for me to be able to witness, at least through story of Hollywood as best they can, what our heroes went through in the skies above Europe. And John, this is quite a day, isn't it?
Well, I tell you what, they did something I was having doubts that they could really do and nail the landing because there were so many storylines they had to wrap
Yeah.
up. And even at the end of episode 8, I was going, I don't know if they could do this or not because there was a lot left. And I will say, after I watched episode 9 twice. They really did wrap it up better than I expected. And of course, my biggest critique, there was the storyline on Crosby. I could have done without that storyline. I would have consolidated some of the storylines, but man, they really did nail the landing. If
I,
you want
I,
to.
I agree. I think there was a lot of, and I could see it in social media before they released episode 9. There was a lot of trepidation. And I even said, I don't see how they're going to leave us feeling fulfilled.
Yeah.
I felt like that we were going to have a bad feeling at the end, like, oh, there's so much that didn't get told and done. But thankfully, the final episode was almost an hour and a half.
Yes.
So it wasn't the shorter. Some of them were only like 48 minutes. It was
That
jarring. It was like, what?
Intro and recapping.
Yeah.
And that took time. Yeah.
So thankfully it was a little longer, but and we're going to go through that in this is really essentially not just our analysis of episode 9, but it's our wrap up of Masters of the Air collectively. And so we're going to kind of go through the scenes that happened in the last episode and how they really did serve to bring us to some closure, which I think both of us agree that we're very positive about the series collectively. I know there's a lot of different conversation about whether it's good or great. And we can, I think at the end of this episode, we can each kind of give our conclusions to that debate, how's it going to stand the test of time? So the first part of the show is back up in the air, very exciting. Bringing up just one of the pictures here. I did get some shots of the show. We see the BA-17s in a mass movement over Berlin. I believe it was 1,000 planes, and there's some really powerful imagery here. This is just one of the pictures.
Melanie, I wanted to point out to the viewers if they didn't notice how all the B-17s are silver now versus the olive drab that you saw earlier in the miniseries. And in the book, they go into a little bit of detail at this stage of the war where the Luftwaffe wasn't a threat anymore, that they didn't bother painting them olive drab, which was a little bit of camouflage.
Well, I understand too, the paint, because of the size of the plane and the thickness of the paint, it was actually put weight on the plane. And so they found it was lighter to not paint it. And since they didn't have the danger and the need to be camouflaged, they just kind of left that off. So yeah, that's very interesting. And the CGI is something that people have complained about. But
I don't get it. I loved it. Maybe I'm showing my age.
I never saw it as
the hardcore people complained they didn't have the nose turret and stuff. And I was like, well, okay, yes, that's correct, but it sure didn't kill it for me.
Not for me at all. I think we're used to suspending reality a little bit, especially when we watch movies like, I'll bring up The Fast and the Furious. Although it reached a point where I couldn't watch that show anymore because it was just like too much suspension of reality. But when you're watching this show and they are doing their very best to recreate a scene that you simply can't recreate any other way, I was able to put myself in those planes and say, okay, I can imagine now what it looked like and what it felt like. And I appreciate it. And I loved this picture here. It comes from the show when they were dropping the bombs, and you actually got to kind of be one of the bombs in a way, looking down as you fell. And so that, I think, is an example of the greatness of the graphics that they used. So they're flying over Berlin, and they're not contested, or so we think. But in that process, we get to see Rosenthal actually be hit, and the heroics that he went to keep the plane flying far enough so that as his crew bailed out, they wouldn't have to land in Germany, where it
Yeah.
would be very dangerous. And you having read the book, I know you were talking to me about how, this to us is the first time he's shot down, but he actually
Had been shot down before
had
and
been.
had broken his arm before. Of course, this one you can see how he hurt his arm again. So in the book, he was an old pro being shot down by this time of the war. So
Yeah, and because of the amount of time they had, they just couldn't give us all of that backstory for him. But here's another great scene, where on the left is his plane crashing, and on the right you can just see him in the top there in his and hanging below his parachute on his way down. And so that was just getting to watch him struggle just to get out of the plane, and seeing some of his crew members had died and were just stuck in it, and watching him bail out. That was a very high intense, high action scene. And of course he lands and ends up in a foxhole in this no man's land, where you see the Russians and the Germans battling it out. You don't know who's going to find him
yes.
at first.
And this point of the war, I mean, he's about as afraid of getting shot by the Russians, because at this stage of the war, they were not taking prisoners.
Oh,
So
interesting.
yes,
Yeah.
and the Russians had a history by this time of the war. Of course, we have the privilege of hindsight, and we know what all the Russians went through and all that. So yeah, they were in no mood to take any kind of prisoner.
I was a little bit entertained by what he said to them when they found him, and he put his hands up, and he was. I don't remember everything, but I remember him saying Coca-Cola.
Yeah, I was. What I was expecting to hear was Mickey Mouse too.
I forget what the other two were, but
Roosevelt, Stalin, Stalin, and
American
Coca-Cola.
Roosevelt, Coca-Cola, and then they helped him out. That was neat. And then of course watching him be assisted by the Russians to get back to Moscow to be able to fly back. And I don't have a lot of pictures from that, but we saw him in the truck, and the smell is so bad. You see so many of them trying to cover their noses, and he gets up to stretch his legs, and he walks into what I understand was a interrogation prison. So it wasn't actually a concentration camp, but an interrogation prison. But what he witnesses, of course, is along the lines of what they saw in the concentration camps. So this is just the burnt bodies just dumped out of, looked like they were the holding cells, but they had just burnt them up in the cells, and then they kind of fallen out into the.
And I kind of want to add there, my papa, who was a B-17 bomber in the 94th Bomber Group, growing up, I can remember specifically asking him, how much did y'all know about the concentration camps?
Yeah.
And he would always just say, son, we just really thought that was war talk. And until the Americans and the Russians started liberating them, and you got the firsthand eyewitnesses, that was the first time it really hit true to, like, my granddad, that this was real and this was going on. And you could imagine, my granddad said, oh, you hear these stories, they're killing women and children. Oh no, that can't be true. That's war talk. It's just propaganda on our side to make them, So
for anyone who's just joining us that maybe haven't been watching, because I do want you to talk a lot about your grandfather's experience. I'm going to just bring up John W. Peace, my co-host, is the author of A Boy from Cracker's Neck that I was able to publish, which is the stories of his grandfather, who was a B-17 bomber pilot in the 8th Air Force, who flew more than 30 missions. So he made it to I always like to bring this up. I think it's fun to say, the Lucky Bastard Club. So your book is full of his experiences and stories. And we have a whole playlist on this channel of us just talking through different chapters. We talk about Operation Gomorrah and Black Thursday, even drafting his crew, which ended up having a lot of Jewish men in it.
His flight crew was 100% Jewish as far as his officers. Even they would hear rumors, he said, about the atrocities that was happening. But you had to be there. I could imagine how it'd be hard to believe. It was almost one of the things you had to see with your own eyes. and that scene, the master's there. And of course, that goes back to Band of Brothers when they liberated one of the concentration camps too, and it kind of hit home that the atrocities. It's hard to imagine, and it's still today, and we know it's fact, and we have all this evidence. It's just hard to imagine.
And this was the part of the show where they were able to depict that, because of course the heroes in the sky weren't down there liberating the camps, but this was Rosenthal's getting a first person experience at just what they were capable of doing. And you do see him go into one of the cells and see the writing on the wall and helping, and he's realizing these are Jews.
And also Rosie's Jewish.
He's Jewish.
So it hits really home to him.
Yeah. So that was a very moving moment. And of course it rolled into this time when he spoke to this Jewish man before they left the area again, talking about what he had to do and burying his family. And that he just didn't, he didn't feel like he had a choice. It was either that or be killed. And he really felt like no one, I don't remember the exact quote, but he felt like no one was going to remember them.
Yeah, even the earth. The dirt.
Yes, that we would be buried in, or buried in the earth, that no one would remember. And I felt that was a very intentional, I hope it was intentional, I'm sure it was, moment to be able to just kind of stop. And with that narration, or not narration, but with that, I'm sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? That scripting, I guess what I'm looking for, that was scripting. To have him say that, I feel like I took it as, hey, let's not forget. We will remember. Yeah. But just look at what an incredible job this man did acting. Look at his face and his eyes and just the despair. And the thing is, he represents the despair that happened at the end of the war. And of course, the wrap-up scenes that we'll talk about in a little while, as people went home to America, are really a high for us all, thankfully. But there was so much despair as well, especially for those that lost loved ones, or those who really had been, bring us closer, who really had been left behind to clean up the mess. And we see them walking through as they're being moved in the march, which is the next thing we'll talk about. We see them walking through the completely blown out cities, and it's hard to imagine recovering.
I was going to ask you if you caught exactly why it was, when the Tuskegee Airmen talk about Nuremberg, and for the viewers, Nuremberg was the capital of the Nazi movement, and that's where the big stadiums were and the big marches in Nuremberg. So when POW train, when they saw Nuremberg, they're in the heart of Nazism right now.
Oh yes, after the march and Bittenheim train,
that was the symbolism and all that.
You saw their reaction to that for sure. Yeah. So the next picture I want to share is from the march, and this is actually a picture I found from the bomb group. And this was the one thing about the show is just there's no way in any movie or show, there's just not time to really capture the experience of, for example, being up in those bombers and the long time they had to fly just to get to their destination. We talked about this before, the adrenaline, the nausea, all that they had to face. The freezing temperatures, and you just can't feel that in the period of time of watching a show. And the same is true with the march. And the march, as they were being moved, didn't feel all that long to us, but I want to share a memory that came from someone named William Bill Couch, who was a bombardier in the 100th Bomb Group and was on the march. His recollection says, by this time, travel in Germany was in a state of near complete chaos. We left at about 3:00 a.m. and traveled about a day and a half on foot. It was so cold, it was a miracle that my feet didn't get frostbite, and my shoes somehow held up. I couldn't help but ask myself, is this hell ever going to end? There was some camaraderie on the frozen march. We were all in it together, and I was willing to help anyone who was in need. And that is such a key message, because that really leads to this scene in the show where we see Solomon, who was a Jewish airmen that had actually been singled out by this German guard, this older guard back earlier as being Jewish, called out for being a Jew. And here the guard was just collapsing, and Solomon goes and helps him up and takes the pack off of him. And so again, another just incredible, beautiful moment in the show where we get to see the humanity that still existed. And as they were marching, of course, it was chaos as described. And so many of the men did escape. And of course, we saw Buck. And
one thing I was going to add a little context
yes,
to
you want
the
to add to that?
viewers. A lot of people were like, well, why did the P-51s shoot at the POWs? But this time in Germany, the German would have to march their troops on foot. So, from the sky, and as far as that P-51 pilot, they just thought they were German troops. So, of course, their job is to shoot on German troops and stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't expect POWs to be marched down the road.
Yeah, you don't know what's going on down there.
Yeah. Oh, you would expect that to be German troops marching under the cover of night. So that explains why the P-51 did what they did. Yeah.
Well, and of course, the P-51 plane comes back later in the show when they have reached their destination and are about to be liberated. And so then we get to see the P-51 come and just shoot at the towers. And that was exciting. At first, it was a little chaotic, I have to say, for me, as I was watching that happen, because the German guards turned and started shooting the prisoners until finally the prisoners actually were able to get control of the guns and, take it over alongside of that. And I did read that actually happened, that, some of the camps were not liberated in such a dramatic way. It wasn't necessary, but in that case that they really did have the army roll up and, kind of just attack.
In the Bookmasters era, a lot of to save their own hides, the German high command in charge POW would peacefully turn over hoping to gain favor.
Yes.
Knowing that, they would probably be charged with war crimes and stuff. So,
well, and I think a lot of them were older, at this point in the war. They were the older ones. They were, they weren't the SS. They weren't they were sort of the ones that got pulled in and forced, just like, and so I think there was definitely some compassion. I liked the way that was ended when they were, kind of dismissed. You're dismissed.
Well, and I also want to tell viewers, the book gives a little bit more context, and I think the documentary that's coming up on the Bloody Hundreds will give a little bit of context. I had one of my family members go, well, gosh, why were they marching these POWs at the end of the war? Why were they? And okay, of course, we know Hitler was going to go, die to the last man. He didn't care, but you still had some German army officers. They wanted to keep the POWs in hopes to have those as bargaining chips for surrender. And you also got to take fact, there's about 40,000 of the 8th Air Force POW, and they were officers. So, they weren't enlisted, they were officers. And so they were hoping to do some trading. Of course, none of that actually happened, but that was the mentality of why they were so determined to hold on to them all the way to the very end.
Yeah. That's really good to bring up, because I did think about that myself, is like, why are they forcing them to march to another camp? I mean, why not just leave and run for your life? And I guess they were still committed enough to the cause that they themselves didn't just go put on civilian clothes and say, okay, don't know anything, but it's interesting the things that people do and suffer on both sides of war. We're going to have a guest on our show coming up in a few days, who's actually a Marine, a United States Marine embassy worker, guard, which is a high-level Marine, whose father was a Green Devil and was captured in Africa and became a prisoner of war on our side. So just for those who are watching, watch for our interview with Franz Geil about his father, who was Green Devil.
And I'm excited to meet Franz and talk to him, because
I'm excited for you too to meet.
I tell you, of course, I wrote about it in my book. One of the best stories my papa would tell me was after the war in like 1952, he actually met in his hometown a Luftwaffe pilot So,
Hmm.
it was so interesting to meet your former enemy and to, compare stories, compare lives. And in
Yeah.
my case, my papa's upbringing was so similar to that Luftwaffe pilot. He said, son, just couldn't imagine. We just were the same, cut from the
Mm,
same cloth, but just born in two different places of the
yeah.
world. So,
And so many of the Germans were not of the ideology of the hardcore Nazis and the SS and the high command. But they're human, and they just wanted to have pride for their country. And so, I'm not excusing all that happened, but it definitely was easy to connect. And of course, we're great friends with Germany now. So,
yeah.
and there's still a few alive
Mhm.
from that time. So I think that says a lot. But then, so we're talking about the liberation of the camp, and yeah, it just there's so many poignant scenes in this final episode. I think that's why for me it was so cathartic, because you just got hit with one um, profound moment after another that really wrapped up what all this meant. And so this is probably one of my favorite scenes. Do you want to say something?
Well, I tell you what, I was wanting to read a little bit, just
Oh,
one paragraph. This comes from the documentary, The Bloody Hundredth,
oh,
because it
good.
kind of puts in perspective exactly how much tragedy we've gone through. Um, I'll read this. When the men of the 100th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force arrived in England in 1943, it had 140 flying officers. Only 4 months later, only 3 of that original group could still fly combat missions.
Yeah. Wow.
3 out of 140 of the
Oh,
original
what a
140.
perspective. Oh my
Okay,
goodness.
and this is a
Oh.
quote from John Lucky Luckadoo. We
Mhm.
were going
Who's still
overseas.
alive, one of the
Yeah,
few that
he's still alive.
just had a birthday a couple
I
days ago
know.
as of this
And his
recording.
quote, "We were going overseas to die." We
Yeah.
knew. And see, now the original 140, they didn't expect to die. They didn't, remember at the very beginning of the series,
Mhm.
you didn't tell me what was going on over here. Now, when my
Mm.
grandfather entered the 8th Air Force, and when they got shipped off, they knew they were going into a bloodbath, and it was a
By
meat room.
then, they knew what they were up against.
Yeah. So,
Well, and we
yeah.
thought that the air superiority was gonna be the thing that won the
Yeah.
war.
Well,
I
first
mean,
of all,
there was
they thought they were
we
immune
had no
to,
idea how rough
yeah.
it was gonna
Yeah,
actually be
no
as
idea. There's
yeah,
some faulty war theory and
yeah,
egos and
yeah.
they just, yeah, and it didn't turn out the
And if
way.
you think about it, air warfare was still relatively new. It was more advanced than it
Hmm.
had been in World War II. The biplanes of World War One, the biplanes and the equipment of World War One just was so changed by World War II. This was just testing it out and
Yeah,
finding out what it could do. And we were very optimistic at the start that, this was going to be just a quick, easy, superiority from the skies from the start to the end. And obviously, being labeled the Bloody Hundredth shows that it didn't go at all as expected at first.
yeah,
Yeah, although we definitely can attribute, I think, the success overall to the air warfare and being able to take out the machinery of Germany and the war machinery in the way that they did. So,
now I'm gonna let you in on something. When you
yeah,
read the book is a little bit more of a Debbie Downer,
yeah,
because the book, the last actually 2 chapters, goes into great detail about the studies the Army did about the war, researching it.
the effectiveness
And
of what they.
here's the sad thing: almost the first 2 years of the bombing campaign, they find out was pretty useless as far as their
Yeah.
objective. Ball bearing plants didn't matter.
Hmm.
And when I say they did research, they interviewed the Germans themselves. They interviewed, production people and stuff, and they found out how much of their original bombing theory was wrong.
Was wrong.
It wasn't until they started bombing the oil refineries, synthetic oil
Mhm.
refineries, and transportation. They said that's what crippled us. It
Yeah.
wasn't what you were doing the first year. So
Well,
almost,
I
yeah,
I stand by what I said,
yeah,
even though he points that out, simply because it was it isn't that life. I wanna just kind of put out there for as a philosophical observation, not just attributing to this show and the war, but to
yeah,
all of us. Unfortunately, they had to go through that what felt like a waste
yeah,
in order to get to the point they were efficient.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important lesson because and I know from my life and things that I've strived to do.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story, but just building a business, even
Yeah.
building this YouTube channel. It's trial and error. And
Yeah.
sometimes the trial and error can be very expensive and take a lot of time. And in their case, the expense was lives as well as the
Yes.
equipment they lost. But
And
I
also, now, one thing,
Mhm.
also the high brass in the Eighth Air Force also had a little tunnel vision. That
Yeah.
in the book, the British were telling them, "Hey, y'all are dropping 500-pound bombs. Those do not hurt U-boat factories."
Ah,
So
yeah.
they were not paying attention to some other people that was trying to tell them some faults in their theory. So they had tunnel vision. We're going to do what we're going to do,
Mhm.
and and of
But
course it's hindsight. It's hindsight. I mean, yeah,
isn't that life though? I
yeah,
I really think this again, this is just this profound lesson that if we look for it, we can pull from war,
hmm,
which is I love war stories for so many reasons because there's just it's like the worst and the best. You see humanities on all ends, but there's so many. I actually co-authored a book with an Army Ranger titled "Tactical Field Manual for the Battlefields of Life,"
wow,
and I use it with incarcerated right now. But and in it, we take all the strategies of war and we can apply them to life and how you have to flank things and you have to approach things and strategies and guerrilla warfare. Anyway, um, there's just so many lessons that we can take from what we've watched and say, okay, it is a shame that they had that tunnel vision. It's a shame they were so optimistic. They should have done this. And hindsight, of course, is 2020 is a big cliche, but let's all give ourselves a pass.
yes,
And we can give the Army a pass for not knowing and having to go through the process of learning. It's so sad that people had to die to learn those lessons. And I guess maybe we could take an even bigger step back. Again, I'm just getting philosophical here, but and say, all right, what could they have done maybe to learn faster,
yeah,
to not have to sacrifice so many lives? Maybe they could have. And to that end, I want to bring up and again rabbit trailing, but I think it fits. um, in the book that I wrote, and I've read some stories from it. I don't think I have a slide of it, but a Triumph Book Heroes. I've got a story from, and we can do a show on this because it's really powerful. There's a he was just a young pilot out of Korea, went to Vietnam. The Marines on Khe Sanh were going to be bombed, and this is
wow,
history most people don't know. But I was able to interview the pilot who had to fly this impossible mission to take out the bombers. And he went on to become the major general that managed the sorties of Desert Storm, which
wow,
we really did win that war from air power. And he said that he and his fellow leaders made the decision at the start of that war. They were not going to make the same mistakes that we had made in Vietnam. And so I think that's a situation where somebody was wise enough to step back and say, what have we learned and what can we do differently?
yeah.
Um, yeah. So anyway, but I'll circle back around to
I
the
know we got off track here.
yeah, no, it's all good, and the sun just dropped down, so I noticed my lighting just changed, but this is live, so
Yeah,
um, so this profound moment that this series was or this last episode was just full of. I wanna bring up the picture of that, and this is the moment that the camp was being liberated, and, Egan climbs up the pole, he finds a flag, and it's a tattered homemade flag of our country. He climbs up and he attaches it, and you can see everybody down below are looking up and watching
yeah,
him and cheering. And then you just get this profound moment. I love this shot where he's just standing there and you see the flag. You see him up there in victory pose, just looking out across the countryside and out beyond the prison. And there's the flag waving, and, I don't know, there's a lot of really high moments in this whole series, and for me, this is right up there, if not one of the highest moments. And the reason is because, and this is something you and I have talked about, I interview veterans, I work with veterans, I publish books about veterans or of veterans. I started a campaign called Love Your Veterans to help people be interested in veteran stories. And I do this because I believe that we all need to have patriotism. And that moment is patriotic to me,
Yes.
to see our flag. And the thing is, there's so many lives that have been lost and so much. We just witnessed all that the bomber groups, we saw the 100th, but all the bomber groups went through. And we've seen Band of Brothers, we've seen the Pacific. I mean, these are the sacrifices that have been made for that flag, for what it represents,
Yeah.
and for our country. And I am heartbroken at how much patriotism has really been under attack, I would say. Sometimes if you're patriotic, you get called, I don't know, extremist. I don't think being patriotic should ever be viewed as extreme. And of course, it's how these people are defining it. But
Yeah.
to say that we have a great country is not a bad thing. And this is something that happened. I wish I had a picture of it. I didn't get one. But the next thing that happened after we won the wars, we started using our bombers to drop food to the
Yeah.
people that were starving. That is what a great country does. And yes, you can be proud of belonging to a country that will turn its war machines into mercy
Yeah.
flights. I mean, I just
And also you got handed to some leaders at the time had learned some lessons from World War One that realized starving people will fight. I mean, they will do terrible things, and all
yeah,
that.
that
And
gave
yes,
them forgiveness pretty quickly,
yeah.
except for the war criminals. But yeah.
Where you
Mhm.
brought up working with veterans, and you brought up the Pacific, and I wanted to bring up one scene. I don't know whether you caught it, the white horse.
Oh,
Did you
yeah.
think much about that and stained with blood? And of
Yeah.
course, now think about this. You work with veterans. Of all the characters that locked eyes with that white horse stained with blood was Buck. Or Buck. Okay. The symbolism of that white horse stained with blood and with Buck was, of all the characters in the whole miniseries, he was probably the most honorable of them all. Didn't drink, didn't
Yeah.
cheat on nobody, honored on this thing.
Yeah.
But if you remember him and Bucky sitting on the air traffic control thing, and Bucky brings out the flask of whiskey and hands it to Buck, he takes a drink
Yeah.
because that symbolism, even though he was an honorable person, he's going to be stained the rest of his life for what he went through during that war. And you work
Yeah.
with these veterans. It doesn't matter how good a person you are, it affects you and it
Yeah.
stains you. And
That's
the symbolism that he's going to be stained the rest of his life, and he will be. You don't go through that and not,
Mhm.
be stained by it.
That I'm kind of using as we wrap up this series a few opportunities to kind of pitch some of
Mm.
the shows that we have in mind as we move into the next phase of our channel,
Yeah.
because we started this channel right alongside Masters of the Air. Obviously, we're called Masters of the Air Talks. We don't intend to end with the series ending. There's so much that we can address and cover. And I know one of the things we want to talk about in this channel is things are things like PTSD and something called sin eaters, which we're looking forward to getting some experts on to discuss what that is and what they were. If anybody hasn't heard the term sin
Yeah.
eater, watch for that in one of our upcoming episodes. But yeah, I agree. I think that they did so much in this final episode to just plop. I don't want to use the word plop. That sounds so unintentional.
Maybe
Just
insert. Yeah.
insert, very carefully insert these moments after moment after moment where you see the Rosenthal speak with this Jewish man and in his despair, and you see Solomon help the guard, and you see Egan climb the flagpole and raise our flag, and then the white horse that Buck saw because he had escaped. He wasn't in the camp. We didn't talk about that, but and how symbolic that was, and freedom. That freedom was coming, and but blood. It took blood to get it. Oh,
He's going to be stained for life.
there's so much you can analyze in just
And,
this last episode.
Of course, all the critics and us too, we've always compared to Band of Brothers and the Pacific, and this has been the third installment. And one thing I will say of all three miniseries, this was the only one that ended in more of a happy note with Bucky and Buck getting back together, friendship.
Yeah, I actually did capture a picture of it to show that. So this was another moment. Of course, we see Buck had just flown a mission to drop the food in Holland, I believe it was. And he's talking to the radio tower as he's making his return flight, and he hears the voice speaking to him, and he says, "Can you
Repeat
repeat
that.
that?"
Yeah.
What did he say? What did Bucky say back? Do you remember? It was very
Oh yeah, you
witty.
know who this is. It's
You
so
know who
very,
this is.
whatever it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it
funny.
was a witty reply, and of course this screenshot is that moment where he's having fun with him, and he's up in the tower, and it probably didn't happen, or who knows, I don't. But you know what, I if this is Hollywood, I love it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, because it just made me so happy. It was a surprise to
Mhm.
just to be able to see him show up and talk. We didn't know, we're with Buck, and he's like, "Who is, can you repeat that?" And then you go to that scene and you see Bucky up in the tower. And it's just like, that's probably the moment I wanted to jump off the couch and, put my hands up. And it was very much circling back to the moment when Bucky was walking into the POW camp
Yeah.
and found out for the first time that Buck was still alive.
Mhm.
And, so we kind of got that really cool moment twice.
Yeah.
And I thank the producers for that, because that's just the good stuff in life. And if it has to be a little bit make believe, well, it happens. We can
Well,
just celebrate those
of
moments.
all three miniseries, this one definitely needed more of a happy ending than
Yeah,
the other
yeah.
two, because of all the tragedy and the
Mhm.
statistics of 3 of the 140 and all, so it was
Mm.
nice to see this kind of, it's not a high end, but definitely on a higher note than like the Pacific. If for those that have not watched it, it shows
Mhm.
them going back home, and I experienced this with my papaw stories of how much they struggled to get back into their lives.
Yeah.
And my
Yeah.
papa used to say, it's hard to go through what they went through, come back home and listen to a boss complain about sales figures or complain about production figures. Can you imagine sitting there going, "Really, buddy? I mean, this is
Yeah.
what you're bitching about, complaining about?"
Mhm.
And that's why they were so hard. And you and I've talked off screen before. One of the reasons why, with the GI Bill and with the Veterans Administration on loans, so many World War II veterans became self-employed and entrepreneurs, is they really couldn't take a boss anymore. And of
Yeah.
course, that led to our economy exploding, and so many other factors. How many of those men actually became self-employed, whether it be construction, mechanics, they weren't going to work for a boss again, complaining about sales figures.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
such an interesting analysis
Yeah.
that can be made. And I agree. I got a couple of scenes from the closing of the show. This was probably again another one of those high impact images, where the fortresses are headed home,
Yes.
and they're flying across a
Yeah.
meadow with some
Yeah.
of the English people standing, kind of watching them go. And you see a burnt out, crash landed bomber down on the ground. I mean, just this visual right here it says so much, but it's very much even though it's got the crashed bomber, it's both sentimental and
Mhm.
joyful, I think.
Yeah.
It's mournful and joyful. And mournful for those that didn't make it, and of course, as they're flying, they say to each other, "So many good men, we're leaving behind." And you really realize just how much loss there was. And then, of course, the final scenes are the planes up
Mhm.
above the clouds, sort of above the fray, so to speak, with the sunset. And just, I mean, it's just that literal Hollywood ending, flying off, not riding off, but flying off
Yeah.
into the
Into the
sunset, so to
sunset.
speak. And, it was great. I loved it. And of course, music that goes with that. Whenever you put music to such an epic show, you
Mhm.
just it transforms the story. And I don't think it makes anything less truthful. I think that when we tell stories and we put them in film and we put music to it, we start to begin to, again, here I am kind of going off looking at life generally. But I think if we all look at our lives and our adversities, because again, war,
Yeah.
it's so applicable to our lives. We're all fighting wars of some sort in our lives. and we're going to have opposition, and we're going to have the enemy of one type or another wants to tear us down. And if we just keep going and we keep plugging at it, and we learn the lessons that we have to learn, and we take the hits that we have to take, eventually we start to get stronger until we finally achieve. And if we were to watch our own lives as a film with a score, an epic score, I don't think it would be aggrandizing anything. I really do believe that life itself is this great heroic adventure that we're all on. And sometimes we die, sometimes we lose loved ones. I've lost a baby, and my only sister passed away 2 years ago, very unexpectedly. And, these things happen. And so I just say that because we all have these parallel lives to these war stories. There's losses, and there's struggles, and there's pain, and there's suffering, and there's times when we're marching in the cold and wondering if our feet are going to freeze off, and then times when we're climbing the flagpole and hanging the flag. I think it's so good to be able to watch these kind of shows or read these kinds of books and appreciate what's been done, but also to internalize and say, this is life. Everything we do is epic, but we don't always see it that way. And I think it will help us get to that point where we are flying above the clouds, up above the fray. And we're going to have those moments.
Yeah.
Of course, those men landed and they had a hard time. My great uncle, I've read his story a few times in our episodes. If people haven't watched it, go back and you'll hear some of the stories of my great uncle who was in a POW camp. And he actually was an alcoholic the rest of his life and died young. And
so many were.
I'm glad we got that high moment, but the truth is it wasn't, it wasn't ice cream sundaes the rest of their lives. Although your grandfather sure did love his ice cream.
Well, he did, but now he struggled for years and really struggled through the end of his life on certain issues we've talked about and stuff. And all these men did.
I'd love you to kind of help wrap up our show by telling us a little bit more about your grandfather's perspective when he got home about war and how he lived his life.
Yeah, and you went into patriotism. He was very He loved his country, but now he was always very skeptical of government. He'd always talk about Germany was the classic example of ultra patriotism, doing whatever your country says to do.
Right.
And you're going to find this. Some people's going to think it's controversial. I remember in the state of Virginia, they were going to pass some laws making it illegal to burn the flag. And hey, trust me, I don't like seeing that. And you know what? But he's going to surprise you. He said, son. He said, if you do that in Russia, they're going to lock you up. If you burn a flag in North Korea, they'll lock you up or kill you. What makes this country great is that freedom of expression. We might not agree with it, but we tolerate it.
Right.
And so,
I agree with that completely.
But he struggled, in his own way. Of course, and I try to do a lot of research on the suicide rates of bomber mission. There wasn't a lot of studies back then. They didn't keep records. It was very high. Everybody would agree it was very high. That
if it wasn't outright suicide, it was suicide by alcohol poisoning.
Yeah. Oh, yes, it was. And he would talk about, it haunted them about all the innocent people they killed. And in the book, talked about the studies of the terror bombings and stuff that didn't really end the war any quicker. In fact, it kind of worked against them because it helped the German propaganda say, oh, gosh, the Americans and the Brits are trying to kill your babies, trying to kill you, fight to the last man. So it kind of the opposite effect. But he would always struggle about the innocent people that he was responsible for, and he was a squadron leader. So not only did he personally do it, he led other men to do that. And but he finally came to terms late in life. It was probably up in his 80s. I always kind of thought that the Lord blessed him with a long life to give him time to come to grips with it.
Wow. Now, how old were you when he actually opened up and started telling his stories?
Oh, just about 15. Yeah.
And so how old was he at that time?
Early 70s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, because he didn't really talk much about it until then, isn't that right? And then all of a sudden,
in fact, if you tried to ask him about it, he was very tactful and would change the subject. And because I grew up playing, he had a shoebox full of medals, and I'd grow up and play with them. But if you kind of talk much about it, they gave them to me, and kind of downplay it and stuff. And then some of his peers in World War II would come by the farm. start talking to them. And, over time, they all kind of started opening up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because even the peers that came by, World War II vets that came by the farm, a lot of them had been through some terrible stuff. I talk about in my book, the Coach Stallards and Ed Clarks, that, Stallard had been through D-Day and fought all the way through the Rhine River. Ed Clark had personally was the man that cut open the chains off of some of the concentration camps and stuff. And so, it was trauma.
Yeah.
They traumatized them for life.
Yeah.
And these were good men, but now let me tell you, you just don't live through that and not be changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it really is important to appreciate what's been done. And yeah.
And the horrors of what men can do to other men. It just, it's,
but we, humanity won out in the end. And again, I think the moment when you see Solomon help the older German guard who had been threatening to him earlier, and you hear stories like Corrie ten Boom, who was in a concentration camp and was out speaking about forgiveness. And one of the worst guards in the camp she'd been in walked up and asked her forgiveness. And, she shook his hand and through the miracle of God was able to give it to him, and then experienced her own miracle. These things don't happen unless you have these hard times. And so, we all have our wars and our battles and our traumas. I'm very much, my publishing company is Triumph Press, and I have a program that I work with veterans called the Triumph Program, because you can't have triumph without tragedy. You just can't. And
it's flip sides of the coin.
Yeah. So to kind of just take that ending and what your grandfather went through. I love your book. I loved publishing it and reading it. And
well, thank you.
And it's a triumph book. It certainly is, and it certainly ends on a funny note too, with your grandfather's trip to the judge for his one and only speeding ticket.
Oh yeah, and and one thing I will say about even his peers, everybody I wrote about, they lived the rest of their life with a certain amount of fearlessness. I mean, and you can imagine what they went through, and when I say they weren't put this way, when government or government officials would talk about being scared of this, or you ought to be fearful of this group, they didn't really see it that way. They weren't a fearful bunch, and they also
nothing compared to being up there just straight flying through flak. You don't change your course, and after that, I can imagine. That's fascinating.
And fear is a product of evil. I mean, evil promotes fear to get people to do stuff they normally wouldn't do. But they were a great bunch of men. I was very blessed to grow up with them, to hear their stories, and also to hear, and this is something that I wanted to write about, that, none of the miniseries covered was exactly these men and who they were and how they grew up before they went in World War II. When I wrote my book, it was not really to tell war stories as much, was to tell the stories of what made these men so tough. And the Great Depression, hunger, violence, all shaped them long before they went into World War II.
Yeah. And that's a lot of what your book is about. Your book is not entirely just the war, but how the Great Depression formed the people who are capable of fighting that war and building our country. And I hope that you'll do more writing on that topic.
Well, I hope so. And I'll leave this with my one character, Coach Stallard. I mean, he said such a famous quote. He said this to me. He said, "Son," I mean, he grew up starving to death on a mountain apple orchard. I mean, just starving to death. And he said, "I would have killed the whole Nazi army before anybody would have put me back on that apple orchard."
Yeah, you want to compare what starving in poverty is compared to war. Because he had food to eat and new boots on his feet. And
we did the show on Charles Bronson.
Adventure. Yeah.
Charles Bronson grew up so poor. He said the first time he'd had 3 meals in the same day was when he joined the army. First time in his life, he had 3 meals in one day.
Yeah.
So
perspective, isn't it?
It's really I wrote my book. That's why you do what to try to show perspective to these younger generations that, now it's so far away. And another thing I'm really glad of, that Apple did the series, it still shows that people are interested in these World War II stories, still interested in the Great Depression.
Well, we got to keep them that way. Yes. We got to work to
show what they went through. Yeah.
And therefore, we're going to keep this show going. We hope that all y'all. I'm from
Yeah.
Texas, so I'm going to say all y'all.
Virginia
And
here.
you're up there. How do you say it there? Do you say all y'all, or do you use y'all?
Y'all. Yeah.
Y'all.
Y'all.
You do use y'all. Yeah. So we're
Yeah. Oh,
Southerners.
yeah. We're
Yeah.
y'all people. Yeah.
Y'all people. We hope y'all will subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And we're going to continue to do live shows. Our intention is to just watch. There's some really great war movies coming out, and we'll go back and watch some good ones. I just watched the film 12 O'Clock High, the original movie, the
I
other
need
day.
to. I
So
need
I
to
think that would be a
watch
good
that. It's
one.
been a long time for me.
And we'll do these live shows, and we'll just analyze. And we'd love to have y'all come and give us your thoughts and add your thoughts. We would love to have you share your experiences watching
Family
these
stories.
films, or your experience in war. Even if if you're a veteran of our current wars, we want to hear from you. And we're going to definitely be addressing topics on PTSD and other things that aren't necessarily just World War II aviation focused. This is kind of our springboard, although I think we're definitely going to keep the name of our show just because it fits so well with John's book. And I'm just going to throw out there the colors of our logo. It comes from John's book colors, as you can see. He's got it in his background. I have it in my background. But with that, I just want to raise a glass. This is my Bubba Gump shrimp stemware. I got this from the Bubba Gump Shrimp restaurant down in Galveston, Texas, and it just says "Stupid is as stupid does." And of course, I think Forrest Gump is a wonderful war movie as well, even though it's fiction. Um, there's just so many good movies that we can talk about. And if you want to come to our Facebook page and share with us what movies you'd like to see us bring up in what will be our military movie club. So if you've ever wanted to be in a movie club, this is it. It's your chance to be in a military movie club. So any final thoughts before we part, John?
Oh, great series. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it truly was. Thank you to everybody who's been following us, and we look forward to seeing you join us in the future.